make sure they look at Josh.
He was cornered.
Hi, Susan. Haven't seen or heard from you. You said something tragic has happened.
All right, welcome back to another Facebook Live Q&A. This is Dave Cawley, the host of the Cold Podcast, which is currently top 10 on iTunes.
Is it top 10?
Yeah.
Watched. That's awesome.
Not that I've been paying attention or anything.
Well,
just,
somebody has to.
Minor details. Actually, not my job. My job is to sit here and handle social with you, and boy, do people have a lot of questions. So thanks for sending those in. Keep them coming. cold@ksl.com is the easiest way to email us, but you can also connect on Facebook, Reddit. We're on Instagram. Yep. We're on Twitter.
All the above.
Yep, we're out there. We're paying attention. We are trying to answer what we can. So episode 11 has a lot going on. And I get the sense, just because I'm privy to some details behind the scenes here, that a lot of it was happening kind of last minute for you. So what I want to know is how much of episode 11 developed within, say, the last couple of days before you actually published the episode.
Released it. Yeah, there were some pretty significant changes that came in late. I think the structure of the episode was mostly in place in the terms of, we knew that the Ely search was going to be a big part of it. The wiretap was going to be a large part of it. The search warrant raid at the house. These were all elements that we had kind of an awareness of going into it. But I learned some things like literally the weekend before we released, just last week, in fact a week ago today, that made me realize, oh my gosh, there was a much broader coordination campaign going on than I previously knew about. So went back to the script, started making some changes, had to make some phone calls to clarify a few things with some of my sources. And I don't want to say that like the entire episode changed at the last minute, but there was quite a bit going on there in the lead up. I mean, we dropped that at 10 p.m. Mountain Time on Tuesday, and I was making changes at 8 p.m. So if that gives you an idea.
Yeah, so that sounds like kind of a lot of stuff.
It's a lot, yeah.
How do you keep up?
Well, you help. Other people help.
I'm just handling the social stuff so you don't have to.
No. We actually have some great people here at KSL that are helping with a lot of things with Cold. TV producer Kira Fairmont is helping me with a lot of this, and the Cold team, as I've kind of taken to calling it, is anyone from people who are reading script for us, doing voices, people who are helping research with documents. Obviously, I'm doing a lot of the production and stuff. So yeah, it's a lot to juggle to get an episode out there, but hopefully the result is that we're doing good journalism.
How much of the show do you do in advance, or have you done in advance?
Boy.
Not as much as you'd like, I take it.
No, so in terms of like how many episodes,
how far out ahead are you?
Not very. I'm making changes to episode 12 right now. I will probably be doing that Monday and Tuesday. 13 is started, but it's a work in progress. So, when we originally launched episode 1, I was about 4 episodes ahead. We're down to the point where it's maybe 1 episode ahead.
Yeah.
So it's a different pace, I would say.
Sure. Well, and I ask that for a reason. One of the most common questions we get, second to how many episodes will there be?
You're going to go there on that?
I'm going to go there, but not yet, is people want to know why you can't do more at once.
Yeah.
And what I typically have done to explain to them is, look, we're doing it as fast as Dave can churn it out, but it is primarily you. Those of us that are on your team are support staff.
Well,
we're not writing the episode. We're not editing the episode.
Right. I mean, I don't like going, hey, look how great I am. That's not what this is about for me. But it is a lot of work, just in terms of man hours to do, or people hours to be gender neutral. It's a lot of work that has to get done for every episode, and just because I have to read that script, I have to write it. Josh Tilton, member of our team, is helping with some of the audio production work now, so that helps. But yeah, it is a lot. A lot of time goes into every episode. I hope that shows in terms of you should come away going, wow, that was a lot of information. It was hopefully presented well. You were interested beginning to end. If that starts to slip, it means we're not doing our jobs.
Sure. So I'm not going to ask you how many episodes there will be because we've already covered that. And people who want to know can go back and watch our previous Facebook videos. But when will the show end? At what event will you be like, okay, that's where I was headed?
I'm still trying to figure that out, because if this is just Susan's story, you could argue that after Josh kills himself and the boys, maybe that's where the story stops. But it's not, because that's not where the investigation ended. And I think it's important to continue pulling those threads, the investigative threads, to see where law enforcement went after Josh was no longer available. So certainly we will carry on after the death of the boys. How far is the question? You know, we know this case was declared cold in 2013, which is when our initial kind of drop of documents happened. You could say that's when we end our story. Or we might just continue right on into the work that we're doing right now, because there are tips and leads and things that have come into us that I want to chase down, and so the podcast might morph into following through to that. I don't know yet.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Okay. What percentage did you reveal about police tactics in episode 11? We had somebody who says they found the tickling the wire concept really fascinating.
It's super fascinating. I think I put more out there than law enforcement probably is comfortable with. Some of this stuff, if you are into, crime shows, is not going to be all that mind-blowing. But if you're not somebody who's familiar with the way these kinds of cases work, it's pretty revealing to see what goes into getting a wiretap, how they, strategize to make sure interesting conversations are happening on those monitored phones. There were elements to Operation Tsunami that I'm aware of because they were part of the brainstorming process that police had. Elements that were never actually executed, and that's where I drew the line. I figured, if the police didn't actually carry out this part of the plan, let's not talk about that, because it's something that they might use in a later investigation, and you don't want to be giving a playbook to somebody on how to avoid potentially being, caught for a homicide.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like Josh had already done some of that, how to avoid getting caught stuff himself, just watching other cases. For example, a couple of episodes back, we mentioned Mark hacking and Lori hacking.
Right. And we find out from some of his computer data that he was researching other prominent murder cases that were playing out at the time. So he was a student of it. He also had a brother, Michael, who was trained in intelligence in the Army. And we'll get into that more later, how those, two brothers interacted in sharing information that way. But I think there's a pretty good indication that Michael, through his work with the Army, was very well aware of what the police were capable of when it came to electronic surveillance.
That's a great segue, because we actually just got a question about Michael, and I have one on my list here already. So 2 parts of a question here. Why weren't police looking at Michael sooner? Did they ever look at his phone records? And then the second part of that, will we go into his suicide in future episodes?
Yeah, absolutely. Michael will become a much larger part of the story once we move past the death of Josh and the boys. Deaths, I should say. Michael basically comes to the attention of police in a bigger way because of Operation Tsunami. That's not something that anybody that was involved has told me. It's my observation from reviewing the documents and kind of seeing where the investigation went afterward. So they have that wiretap up on Josh and Steve's phones. So anybody that Josh is talking to, they potentially can listen in on that conversation. There are a whole bunch of rules when it comes to wiretaps about if a conversation is relevant, then you can listen. But if it's not relevant to your investigation, they actually have to stop listening at some point, because the government wants to be very clear that they can't just listen carte blanche to whatever you're saying. If you call your attorney and you're talking about a case, they got to turn the wiretap off and stop listening. But Josh and Michael have some very interesting conversations when they're monitoring Josh's phone, where they are discussing things related to Susan's disappearance, and Josh or Michael will say, we probably shouldn't be talking about that right now. I'll send you an email. and they were communicating outside of the wiretap, essentially.
Did they know there was a wiretap?
I don't think they specifically knew. Josh, going back to the very first week of Susan's disappearance, was telling his family in some conversations that he thought that police were listening in. He was a little ignorant in that way, like you can't just go get a wiretap based on probable cause as the very first thing. They have to go through that exhaustion that I talked about in the episode. You have to try everything else before you get the wiretap.
We have somebody asking if the recording of the wiretap is available, knowing that you had so much audio from other sources. I know the answer to this, but I wanted to give you a chance to address that.
That's a great question. Would I like to listen to that and share that? Yeah. I would find that incredibly compelling. But in terms of secrecy, audio coming off of a wiretap is really, really, really difficult to get. You will not find, I'm not aware off the top of my head of a case where that audio is played unless it comes out as part of a trial in court. At that point, it becomes part of the public record and could be used. And you might have seen that in this case had it ever resulted in charges, but it is not anywhere that I can get access to it.
Here's another question we actually get kind of a lot. What is the status of Josh's encrypted files, and are decryption efforts underway?
Well, episode 12 is coming.
Spoiler alert.
The encryption is actually a big part of what we're going to be talking about in episode 12. You know, I teased the RCFL at the end of episode 11, which is the FBI's Regional Computer Forensics Laboratory here in Salt Lake, where, you know, all these drives, all these computers that are seized as these search warrants are served, ends up. And, you know, I don't want to get too far into cataloging the status of every single drive because there are so many of them. But in a broad sense,
these people had a lot of computers.
They had a ton of computers. But we're going to go into that and kind of give you the latest information that we know about where those efforts stand in episode 12.
Here's a good question, too. I know we don't know how or what exactly Josh might have done to Susan, but do you get a sense that Josh thought the snowstorm was an advantage or a disadvantage on December 6th and 7th of 2009?
Good question. We know that Josh was doing searches about the weather right before he left the house based on information that was retrieved from his computer. And to me, it seems like it would have been an odd decision, you know, presuming at that point that Susan is alive and you're looking at the forecast and you see this big storm coming in. If you're afraid of that storm, and again, this is all hypothetical, but if Josh is planning to kill Susan that night and there's big weather and you know that you're going out and this could be a risk, you would, I would think, delay that plan. So my gut read of it is that Josh actually viewed that as being beneficial. But I also don't know what was in his head at that moment, so it's totally speculation.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with neither of us having an insight into his head, to be honest.
Right.
Yeah. In the last episode, somebody is writing, it seems that Detective Maxwell was getting somewhat aggressive in the investigation. Does he get more aggressive once Operation Tsunami is completed, or once Operation Tsunami is completed, is that when the case went cold?
Right. What you're seeing in terms of the police tactics at this stage of the investigation is they've switched from what I think would be very familiar to people in terms of a police investigation, you know, questioning suspects, and now they're approaching it from kind of a different angle. They're trying different things that most, I think, agencies aren't really. I mean, the stuff with the wiretap, that's a very rare circumstance, especially here in the state of Utah. Not frequently does that happen. So, in terms of, you know, aggression, I think the police were pushing this case, but it took time to get all the pieces for that element together. So, early 2011, they're doing all of the groundwork to set up this operation, and then they're going through and executing it. What you see happen after Tsunami is a lot more effort to go after not just now phone lines, but, you know, can we tap, you know, internet access? Can we look back at, you know, historic emails, things like that? And they will continue doing that kind of intelligence digging work pretty much right up to and beyond when Josh kills himself and the boys.
Do you know if this podcast has generated some new leads?
I don't know if anybody has shared anything with the police that I wouldn't be privy to. Certainly we've had people reach out with theories and ideas. I have questions now that I wouldn't have even conceived of when I started out. In terms of leads, has this reactivated the case? I don't know. It's a good question for the West Valley City Police Department.
Are there any active searches still happening from police as a result, or not as a result?
Right. Not that I'm aware of. I think it would take some very specific information to get West Valley actually actively out in the field on this case again. It's not to say that that couldn't or maybe hasn't happened, but if it has, I'm just not aware of it. So,
when police told Josh they had his car, his home, his computer, and then turned around and gave him his keys, why didn't they keep them and not let him have those?
Right. So if we're going back to episode 5, which would be this interview that Ellis did with Josh on December 8th of 2009, this is part of the strategy, right? So Ellis wants Josh to know that they're serving the warrant on his car, that they're serving the warrant at the house. But the reason he gives him the keys back is because they put that GPS tracker in the minivan and they wanted to see where he went. The problem was they kept Josh waiting too long because you have to get court authorization to install, these kinds of tracking devices, and that eventually led to Josh getting a rental car and disappearing for 800 miles.
Yeah. Have you interviewed any of the psychics who were initially involved in the case?
Personally, no. There's a woman who's been very active in providing tips to police and went out with American Search Dogs, and some of the other groups has been very active in talking to Susan's friends and family, who one of the members of our team, Daniel Prager, has spoken with, but I personally have not.
Why are you so sure that Steve Powell was not involved in the actual disappearance?
That comes from a number of places, and I'm going to explore that in depth once we get to a later stage of the podcast, because it does deserve to be talked about. When I started this investigation, and just as a reporter covering this case originally with everything that came out about Steve, it certainly seemed probable that Steve had something to do with it. And when I first sat down with Alice Maxwell and started asking him about his take on the case, he told me, nah, Steve didn't take part. And I was kind of shocked by that. I was like, what do you mean Steve wasn't involved? And I think with everything that we've shown so far in the podcast, you see why to a certain point in the investigation, Steve was very much a person of interest. If not in Susan's murder, then at least in obstruction of helping Josh after the fact. But material comes available because of forensic review of Steve's computers and his journals and things that indicate that he likely had nothing to do with it. So I hate to say I'll tell you later, but that's the gist of the answer.
Were Steve's computers as heavily encrypted as Josh's?
No. Josh, Josh was using encryption. There was some indication that Alina, his younger sister, was also using encryption when they took her computer out of the house in August of 2011. But as far as the troubles getting access to things, I don't think they had, as far as I'm aware, nothing with Steve's digital data was problematic.
There's some familiar voices that come up in this episode to those of us who worked the case back in the day in the newsroom. One of those belongs to a sergeant with the West Valley City Police Department who maybe unfortunately shares a name with one of the players in the podcast.
Mike Powell, yeah.
Right. So we have somebody asking, whatever happened to him? Is he no longer around? Did he move on? Do you know?
He's no longer with West Valley. My understanding from another member of the KSL newsroom, Deseret News newsroom, is that he's working investigations with the Utah Attorney General's office now. He was the public information officer for the city at the time. He was also involved in some of the physical searches, so He was on the West Valley City dive team. I mentioned, they went and searched ponds and things like that. Sergeant Mike Powell took part in that, so he was actively involved in the investigation in addition to his duties talking about the case.
Was anybody in this case, whether Josh or somebody else, ever given a polygraph exam?
A polygraph, no, as far as I know, but the police did use a form of lie detector called a CVSA, which is a computer voice stress analyzer, and they used the CVSA on a number of people. Most of them were potential persons of interest. A good example is Tim Peterson, who was Josh and Susan's neighbor, who Steve Powell tried to paint in the very first few weeks of the case as somebody who might have abducted Susan. And police went and talked to Tim. They interviewed him several times, and Tim willingly did a CVSA, and it showed that he was being truthful with the police. There were a number of others who, as the police were pursuing leads, submitted to CVSAs, and almost without exception, they all passed those tests.
And I don't know as much about the CVSA as you do, probably, but I know polygraph exams tend not to be admissible in court for a number of reasons. Same deal with CVSA?
CVSA is more of a tool to allow the police to determine whether or not somebody is being honest with them. It's more to rule out a person of interest than, and this is my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, I should clarify.
Right.
But it helps them kind of figure out, hey, is this person being straight with us? Putting Josh into a CVSA, if it had shown he was being deceptive, may or may not have been admissible in court, but what it would have allowed them to do is turn the screws on him. They would have been able to ask him direct questions, and part of the CVSA exam is they do Mirandize you. So they read you your Miranda rights before you take the CVSA exam. We know Josh was reluctant to, accept his rights when he did that interview with Ellis on December 8th, and so that would have been another way of getting him to acknowledge that he had these rights, waiving those rights, and speaking about the case.
Sure. And he did turn down, or at least not come back and complete one of those exams.
Repeatedly. So this was an element that you heard in the podcast when Josh came in for a blood draw. The police got a warrant that allowed them to draw Josh's blood. He came in with his attorney, Scott Williams, and one of the first things that Ellis Maxwell asked Scott Williams is, hey, where do we stand with the CVSA? And in so many words, Scott Williams told him, we're not doing that.
Did your investigation find out anything that wasn't already known by authorities, and if so, what?
Yes. So there are a few things that have come up. One, I think the most significant thing that we learned was that Josh had visited a physical therapist 10 days after Susan's disappearance, and at that time was diagnosed with a rotator cuff strain or possibly a tear. And that information was unknown to police. Since that time, I've been able to learn a few other clarifying details about that. So it seemed to matter when we uncovered that information because it would suggest that perhaps Josh was injured while either in the act of a homicide or moving a body potentially. Speculative on that, but it raised the question. Some other information has come forward to suggest that Josh was actually in contact with that PT's office before the disappearance. So that's a little, it undercuts maybe that idea somewhat. But we've shared that information with Ellis, and the police are now aware of it. They have some clarifying details as well in their case files if they want to dig into that farther than they have available to them now. We've clarified some information about where Josh and Susan and the boys went on their camping trip. There was, I think, in late May of 2009, they went out on the Pony Express Trail. You heard me in episode 7 report that they went to Topaz Mountain. That was based on photos that Susan had published on Facebook. Since that time, I've been corrected and have independently verified that those photos were taken at another location, not Topaz Mountain. And so
And to be clear, I don't think Susan actually knew where she was.
Right, and that's part of the problem, is the way she described it, it basically was, it sounded like they went out to Topaz Mountain. So it's not solving the case necessarily, but it's helping provide, I think, more clear understanding of some of the fine details. And ultimately, I think that's the way an investigation works. You go piece by piece by piece. Hopefully, something that you learn here that seems insignificant builds another brick, and you just keep, putting that whole mosaic together.
We know what happened as a result of the search of Stephen Powell's house, but do we know how the Powells reacted after the fact?
Yes, to a degree. And again, this goes back to the recordings on the wiretap. The police were listening in on these phone calls, and they obviously would have had a much greater understanding of what was discussed than I do, because I'm going off of a couple of descriptions that were in court papers. But certainly Josh was not happy with Steve, because the search warrant at the house was the catalyst for the state of Washington eventually coming in about a month later and taking the boys away. So Josh recognized right away that Steve's collection of Susan's things, the voyeur photos and whatnot, put him in serious jeopardy. And so there's some indication that he was very angry with his dad about that. Josh and Michael talked a lot of smack on West Valley, as I understand it, on the wire. And there were, again, conversations about how to protect themselves from eavesdropping and things like that.
How much do you think Josh knew about the stuff that Steve had collected? Did he know the extent of what Steve had?
It's tough to say. Reading between the lines a little bit, if we rewind the clock back to July of 2003, Susan very clearly tells her husband that, hey, your dad, he told me he's in love with me. He came on to me. That's not cool. And Josh's response at the time was anger for about 2 weeks. And we know from Steve's journal that Josh basically forgave him pretty quickly after. By 2009, before Susan disappears, Susan's writing in her journal that she is, frustrated that Josh is supporting his dad, that he's basically blaming her that ever happened. And we also know that Josh, his company, his personal web design company, Polished Marketing, built Steve Chantry's music website. So Josh had his hands all over the lyrics for his dad's songs. I think it's pretty safe to say Josh was well aware that his dad was infatuated with Susan. Whether or not he was fully aware of the photos, the voyeur photos, things like that, maybe not, because Steve Powell told the FBI when they did a consent search of his home in May of 2010 that please don't tell Josh about what you saw in my filing cabinet.
So I guess that kind of leads into a second part of the same question, which is, did he learn more about what Steve had collected after the search?
Yeah. My understanding is after the search, Steve came clean with Josh and said, look, you need to understand what happened, what they took, what they have. And that's why Josh was so upset, because I think Josh recognized at that time that the evidence that was seized out of Steve Powell's closet and bedroom was not good for him.
Is there anything else that the police wish that they could have done to get an arrest on Josh from hints he may have said or done?
I can't speak for the whole West Valley City Police Department. There were a lot of investigators who worked on this case. And it wasn't just West Valley. As this case, went into late 2011, 2012, you've got, U.S. Marshals, FBI, DEA, U.S. Attorney's offices, all involved, all kind of taking stock of the evidence and things. In my conversations with Ellis Maxwell, I don't get a sense that there's one moment where he goes, oh, we should have arrested here, because the thought seems to be, once the boys were out of Josh's control, they had time to put their case together, and they were on a timeline to do that. I'm going to be sharing some insight about what was happening behind the scenes in the next couple of episodes about, could they make an arrest on other evidence, stuff not related to Susan, before the end of 2011. Those conversations were happening, and part of what impeded that was prosecutors who, taking stock of the evidence that they had and what the laws were, decided that they weren't going to go forward with that. So in a sense, I think the police would have liked to have had a prosecutor's office that would have probably allowed them to make an arrest sooner, but that was kind of the circumstance they were working with.
Do you know if police ever searched Steve Powell's backyard?
Yeah, so the house eventually, and this is skipping way ahead, but Steve goes to prison on the voyeurism charges, and there's a civil judgment against him for essentially for compensating the victims in that case. As part of that, he had to sell the house. The house actually ended up in the hands of the mother of those girls in the voyeurism case, and at that time, my recollection is, it's been a bit since I looked at this, so forgive me if it's a little vague here, but that the house was searched, the yard was searched, either by law enforcement and or by the Cox family at that time.
Sure. Since we are talking about the search warrant in the house and all of that interesting stuff,
yeah.
I hesitate to use the word interesting. What was in John's room was so incredibly disturbing. Do we know for sure that John wasn't involved?
There's no indication that John was involved in anything having to do with Susan's disappearance. And again, John is still alive. My understanding is there are some concerns about John's mental health, and because he has an expectation of privacy, he's not suspected of a crime by law enforcement as far as I'm aware. I'm hesitant to go into too much detail beyond what we know they found in the room, but suffice to say that law enforcement felt very comfortable that he wasn't involved.
Do we know whose hair he had?
I don't know the answer to that question. Sorry.
Toenail clippings?
Again, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know that I want to know.
I feel like Gary Sanders basically said it for everybody when he said it was a house of horrors.
Right. And I mean, you don't want to play up the drama too much.
You don't have to.
But certainly those kinds of things are abnormal. We posted some photos to our website, thecoldpodcast.com. You can see what John's bedroom looked like. It was extremely cluttered. Some weird things in there that Gary, talked about, I think, very well in episode 11. So even though I don't think they looked at him as a suspect in any way, going into that environment, you could make a pretty strong case that it's maybe not somewhere that you want young kids hanging around, and that's ultimately what the court decided up there in Washington.
Was Steve Powell interviewed in prison after Josh killed himself and the boys?
They tried, and we'll talk about that in episode probably 14. Law enforcement was very interested in talking to Steve Powell about what had happened, but if you look at the way Steve talked about that interview, he felt at the time that the whole thing had been staged. There was a moment where I think he decided that maybe they were trying to entrap him. I think he later comes to terms with the fact that Josh is dead based on what he wrote. Steve didn't tell them anything, and the more they pushed, the more he just refused.
We have somebody asking about the Nutty Putty Cave. So for people who are not familiar with Utah news, there's a different cave that wound up being sealed up after somebody got trapped in there and then ultimately lost their life. So the question is, was the Nutty Putty Cave closed the same day Susan went missing? Is there any chance he went that direction instead of his normal spots?
There are some indications that Josh was aware of Nutty Putty Cave. Without going too far into detail right now, suffice to say he was watching the story And the story was around Thanksgiving, so the day before, if I remember correctly, the day before Thanksgiving of 2009, about 2 weeks before Susan disappeared, there was a man who was spelunking in Nutty Putty Cave, which is to the west of Utah Lake, kind of on the fringe of Utah's West Desert. So in an area that Josh might have been aware of. This man became pinned inside the cave. There was a huge effort to rescue him that ultimately failed. He died in the cave, and the decision at that time was made to seal the cave. They were not able to retrieve his body. So the concrete for the plug that blocked Nutty Putty Cave was actually poured on December 3rd, 4 days before Susan was reported missing. The other challenge with that is anybody who's been in Nutty Putty Cave will tell you pushing 130 pounds, 140 pounds of dead weight, even just through the opening of that cave would have been difficult to the point of impossible. After the fatality in the cave, the Utah County Sheriff's Office had the entrance under basically round-the-clock surveillance because they didn't want people going in and going into that space until they had the chance to close it. I'm debating doing something more about Nutty Putty. If I do, it will come after we've kind of wrapped up the main coverage of the case.
Josh seemed interested in having his neighbor Dax finish that deck. Has the thought been explored that there's evidence below the deck that he wanted to hide?
Yeah, so in the yard of the Sarah Circle house, that deck, they had to dig out some rocks to put the footings for the deck and things like that. That house has been thoroughly searched. The yard has been searched. The shed out back has been searched, and it was searched while Josh was still alive, a lot of this. So there's no indication that that Susan was anywhere on the property.
Is the Cox family, we've actually answered this question before, is the Cox family aware of or involved in this podcast?
Right.
Obviously you hear from Chuck.
Right, yeah, aware of. When necessary, I get in touch with the family or their attorney, Ann Bremner, who's still very active in this case. I've been up to speak with her in Washington. We continue to share ideas and information by email. But I am also trying not to, hound the Cox family because they've been living through this nightmare for many years. So it's kind of a balancing act. If there's something that I think they need to know about, I reach out. Other than that, that's kind of where it stands.
Working with the detectives, could you tell how close they were to the case and how much it had affected them emotionally?
I can tell you for Ellis, I think talking about the case for him has been beneficial. He's told me that it was good to sit and speak about what he experienced, and that he continues, I think, to process a lot of what he went through. There were, again, a lot of investigators who worked this case, and their experiences are all probably unique and individual. My hope is that the podcast, putting a lot of this out there in a comprehensive way, allows people who experienced that trauma firsthand in their own lives, be it Susan's family, friends, law enforcement, prosecutors, the public at large, to have a chance to maybe, and I hate to use the word, but get some of that just closure.
Sure. What do we know about Steve Powell's childhood and or his parents?
Yeah. We know quite a bit, but some of it is a little beyond the scope of the podcast. Generally speaking, Steve was, my understanding is Steve was a convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints when he was a teenager. He attended BYU. He served a mission for the church and was a regularly attending member until early in the lives of his kids, I mentioned in early episodes that he attempted to pull Jennifer out when she was a teenager of the church, and that caused a big rift in the marriage. But if you look back at Steve's parents, a lot of what was going on in their marriage, I think, is familiar to the way Steve treated his kids after his divorce from Terry, and that is that they were kind of using the kids as pawns a little bit. That his parents played what Jennifer described as the kidnap game, where one parent would take the kids, load them in the car, and they would drive away, and the kids wouldn't know where the other parent was, and they would be gone for a long time, and the parent that was wondering where the kids went would track them down, and this kind of went back and forth. Steve, even on his music website, wrote about some of those experiences, which might seem an odd way to market yourself and your CD, but it was something that he talked about quite a bit.
Yeah. Do you have are there any privacy concerns with sharing so much of, say, Susan's journals, both as an adult and maybe her childhood journals?
Right. Yeah. So journals are a big part of this story. Steve journaled, Josh journaled, Susan journaled. You could even argue that the police case file, in a way, is the police journal of this case, right? We're drawing information from a lot of different sources. Early on, I made the decision that I did not want to be in a position of victimizing Susan any more than she already has been. And you've seen now in the podcast the way her childhood journals have become something that Steve and Josh are threatening to make public in an effort to paint her in a bad light. The reason they did that is because in Susan's teenage journals, she's talking about teenage things. And I think anybody who's lived through teenage years can imagine, what do you write in that kind of a journal? And do you want your adult self to be judged by the things that happened when you were a teenager? If you look at the courts in America, typically if you commit a crime under the age of 18, they send you to juvenile court, unless it's something very heinous. And the reason they do that is because you shouldn't be punished for the rest of your life based on making a mistake as an adolescent. So that was kind of the standard that I used in determining I'm not going to talk about what's in Susan's childhood journals. Her adult journal and her emails I view a little differently. One, because they were taken as evidence in this case, and when the West Valley City Police Department declared the case cold, they put the redacted case file, which included that journal and those emails, out to the public. So in some sense, the decision to publish or not publish has kind of already been made. But there's an editorial decision-making process that goes on in what do we include, what do we not include. Susan, sometimes in her journal or emails, will write about the status of intimacy in her marriage. If it's descriptive in a way that I think is not necessary to include, I don't include it, because there is that degree of hey, there should be a bit of a curtain around some of that private life. But there's relevance in talking about the status of her marriage, her arguments with Josh, the way she's talking to her friends about her fears. And Susan, being a victim of a crime, presumably having been murdered, didn't have a chance to answer back the accusations that Josh and Steve were making publicly about her. And so for me, the argument in favor of publishing those pieces of the journals and emails is allowing Susan to have her voice in speaking back against some of the, I think, falsehoods that were spoken about her.
There's somebody who wrote, I could be wrong, but I don't remember if it was ever explained what the wet spots on the living room floor and couch came from.
No, I mean, there were the buckets. So this is going back to when Josh, in January of 2010, comes back to the Sarah Circle house. He's collecting his stuff to load in the U-Haul to take to Washington. And the people who are helping him move out of the house notice that there's a spot on the floor presumably from some buckets that were taken out of the basement. I'm not perfectly clear on what that was that spilled. Josh made a joke about, oh, it's blood, I got to clean it up, which is why it's included in the podcast, because it's an odd thing for him to have said, a month after Susan disappeared, cracking jokes about blood and things, because at that point he's pretty well aware that the police have come in, they've taken the couch, they've cut out the living room carpet, they've swabbed the tile for blood in the living room. So that's why that's in there. As to what that chemical or substance was, I'm not positive right now.
Did they ever interview, meaning I'm assuming they means police here, did they ever interview Josh's mom? We haven't heard so much about her except in the beginning when she and Steve separated.
Yeah, they did. They interviewed Terry a few times. I mean, they were in contact with her quite a bit through the investigation. Terry ends up having a bit of a rift with Jennifer, who was cooperating most closely with the West Valley City Police Department, and that's going to come up in the next couple of episodes. You'll see kind of why that happened. At that point, I think some of Terry's contact with the police came to an end, and I also think based on what I've seen of those conversations, that the police just didn't feel like she had much information to share.
How is this affecting you personally and emotionally?
Well, I don't know. Certainly, the more we dig into some of the materials that we've gained, the more exposure I've had to things, pictures, statements that are I would categorize as disgusting. And I'm not seeking those experiences out for my own enjoyment. It's more a feeling of responsibility to verify that what police say they found is actually what they found. And to this point, I can say that's true. I don't doubt that has a psychological effect that I probably don't really have my hands around right now. So it's not a great answer to your question, but yeah, it's had an impact.
Sure. I think all of us as reporters have at least one story that we've come across at some point that just sort of gets under our skin and stays with us. Would you say it's fair to say that this is yours?
It's one of them. I can tell you I've never been as close to a story as this, and that's a disconcerting feeling as a reporter. Usually there's a bit of arm's length. You're reading and you're reporting facts, but you are separated to a degree from those facts. But because of the amount of time that I've spent with this case, and especially in speaking with people close to it, you do develop. It's a professional relationship, but you do develop relationships with the people who lived through it, more so than just if I interview you when something happens and then I go write my story and then we don't talk again. Staying in touch with people who were impacted by this and continuing this conversation week after week after week after week, it makes it feel more real in a way. And so I think in that sense, this will be probably the story of my career.
One last, I guess, kind of investigative question, and then we'll go on to some more how people can help kind of stuff.
Sure.
We have somebody who wanted to know what stage of completion the house in Saratoga Springs that Josh Powell had been selling or that he had visited was in.
I don't have a great answer to that because I don't have any photos of it at the time. You can kind of imagine the timeline, though. If that was December of 2009 and the house was inhabited by April or May, it was probably pretty far along. I would imagine foundation work and that kind of stuff was probably done, but I don't know the answer to that question.
All right. Have you gotten any impressions from your interviews about how we/you, the public, can help? What can we be doing?
That's tough because we know there's a public search that people have have planned to go do out in the West Desert. We're not taking part in that ourselves, but I get why people want to do that. This feeling that we want to rush out and help. Honestly, I think the best thing that somebody can do if they want to help with this case, and this is going to sound maybe like a bit of a dodge, but it's something I honestly believe, is talk to somebody you care about what you have heard in this podcast that made you, maybe that shocked you, or that angered you, or that made you feel sympathy for Susan. Because the reason why I feel strongly about the need to tell this story is what it tells us about abuse in our society. And in a lot of ways, it's too late to help Susan. We certainly want to bring finality to the situation and allow her family to know what happened to her and to be able to put her to rest with her boys. That's a laudable goal. But I think we individually can have much greater impact by focusing on the lessons that we take away from this story, in not allowing domestic abuse to go unchecked, and in helping people who are in abusive situations recognize that there are safe ways to leave those situations, that they don't need to stay in a place where they are being manipulated, taken advantage of, where they are living in fear of their own safety or the safety of their children, and that we collectively, as a society, have the power to put an end to that kind of abuse.
And there's a reason why that's part of your message at the end of every episode,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So if you do know somebody, or if you yourself are recognizing Susan's story in your own life, please do get help. There are lots of resources out there. Dave highlights them every episode. We have them linked on the website,
Yes.
thecoldpodcast.com.
Absolutely.
We don't want ever to have to tell a story like this again.
And we're encouraged by the number of people who have already shared with us that that the podcast has made a difference in their lives. So thank you so much for listening, sharing, and talking about Cold. And we'll be back with episode 12 next week.